Good evening. Just a short word. Because we're live streaming, we have to begin on the dot at 7 o'clock. That'll be in about 3 minutes. So get your refreshments, get a glass of wine and some cookies and fruit, and then we will begin at 7. Thanks.
I'm wondering where my sister is. She was going to too.
Did the weather scare her off? No. To the middle? Or?
No, it's probably good. The other time you have the exit sign right behind you, so it's probably better here. How you doing? Good to see you. Good evening. I'm Father Michael Hilbert, Associate Pastor at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all, those here gathered in Wallace Hall and those who join us via live stream, to the second in our parish lecture series for 2023. On behalf of our pastor, Father Dennis Yasalona, and our entire parish community, I am honored to introduce this evening's lecture, entitled Peacebuilding as Cornerstone of Pope Francis's Vision for the Church. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there is doubt, true faith in you. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, only light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. The famous prayer of St. Francis of Assisi is an inspiration to so many, and it is sung and prayed throughout the world in countless languages. I am always touched by how many people want this prayer sung at their funerals as a kind of valediction and legacy. On a personal note, it was my mother's favorite prayer, and we sang it at her funeral. Take, Lord, receive all my liberty, my memory, understanding, my entire will, all that I have and call my own. You have given all to me, now I return it. Dispose of it wholly according to your will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. The prayer of St. Ignatius Loyola is less well known, perhaps, but it is equally powerful as a foundation for a life dedicated to the glory of God and the help of souls. It is not an easy prayer. It is a prayer of total offering that becomes more challenging and at the same time more beautifully urgent with the passing of the years. Pope Francis embodies and teaches both the Franciscan and the Ignatian visions of the world and of our mission in the world as Christians, together with all persons of goodwill. When he chose the name Francis, I'm sure we all remember, he explained that it was out of devotion not to St. Francis Xavier, but to St. Francis of Assisi. And we have been marveling at and grateful for his prophetic choice for almost 10 years. Tonight we welcome another teacher of the faith who breathes the peaceful, clear air of Assisi, who is committed to building peace. Bishop John Stowe, Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky, a member of the Order of Friars Minor Conventual, the Conventual Franciscans, has also imbibed, if I might use that word, the Jesuit charism of finding God in all things and discerning God's will through the exercise of Ignatian prayer and meditation. Bishop John was educated by the Jesuits at St. Louis University and at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, California. At St. Louis, he majored in history and philosophy, and at JSTB, he specialized in church history. In 2015, it will be 8 years next month, Pope Francis called this Franciscan with serious Jesuit bona fides to the pastoral care of the Diocese of Lexington. Bishop John has spoken out eloquently and often for peace and for equality, against discrimination of any kind. He is the Bishop President of Pax Christi USA, which last year celebrated its 50th anniversary. Bishop John, you are most welcome. Please speak to us of peacebuilding as cornerstone of Pope Francis's vision for the Church. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Michael. I can't imagine a better introduction with two beautiful prayers that reflect two important influences in my own spirituality and life and my approach to the church and my approach to the world. When I was introduced as the new Bishop of Lexington 8 years ago, I presented myself as a Jesuit-educated Franciscan appointed by a Jesuit Pope named Francis. And all the diocesan clergy were nervous. But I'm very honored and delighted to be part of this series, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, here at St. Ignatius, because any opportunity to reflect on and to promote peacemaking as an essential part of the Christian vocation is a blessing to me. As the Bishop President of Pax Christi USA, I follow in the footsteps of some pretty remarkable bishops who were real leaders in the Catholic peace movement. Bishops like Walter Sullivan, Carol Dozier, and Bishop Tom Gumbleton, for example. They were, and in Bishop Gumbleton's case still are, tireless in their advocacy for nonviolence and for peace with justice. I am grateful for my Franciscan heritage, inspired by that poor man of Assisi who sought to be a lesser brother, a friar minor, to all of humanity and all of creation. And I've also been profoundly influenced by the Ignatian values learned in my Jesuit education, especially as expressed since the time of Pedro Arrupe. It was the witness of the faith that does justice given by the martyrs of Central American University in San Salvador in 1989 that prompted me to request permission of my Franciscan community to study theology with the Jesuits in Berkeley. Peacemaking, along with the entire body of the Church's social teaching, has for too long been seen as a specialization in ministry or in theology, but peripheral to the real work of the Church in furthering Christ's salvific mission. Studying theology at the Jesuit school in Berkeley meant that these teachings were presented as central to understanding and living the faith, and crucial to ministering to God's people. During my time there in Berkeley, the first Gulf War began, and our regular witnesses for peace and our frequent protests nearly caused me to fail New Testament Greek. So I'm not speaking on Scripture tonight. For too many, it seems enough to know that Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and that his witness of active, nonviolent resistance right up to his death was profound. But then we, his followers, say that we live in the so-called real world, and we found countless ways over the centuries to justify war, to justify extravagant spending on the military, to promote nuclear weapons as a deterrent, and to even think and call military forces peacekeepers. In so many ways, the pacifism of the early church has diminished so considerably over the centuries as to become practically extinct. But I think of Ben Salman, a layman whose cause for canonization has been introduced because of his faith-inspired, conscientious objection to World War I. In 1918, he was sentenced to prison, and his mental health was questioned for his refusal to fill out a questionnaire for entering the military at a time of war. He was also expelled from the Knights of Columbus because he resisted conscription. He was faithful to Mass and the sacraments. He took fasting and penance very seriously, but he earned the scorn rather than the support of the hierarchy who had blessed and justified the war. And still, one of his sons became a priest, one of his daughters a religious sister. From a hospital bed, he wrote a 200-page letter explaining how the gospel, his commitment to Jesus Christ, and the teachings of the Catholic Church specifically made him refuse to bear arms in war. There is a bensalmon.org website if you want to learn more about him, and it's salmon spelled like the fish. Perhaps better known as the anarchist journalist, convert to Catholicism, Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic Worker Movement together with Peter Maurin. Her cause for canonization is much farther along. It has been formally introduced in Rome. She, too, was a pacifist, but she also committed her life to living among the poor and the outcast. She definitely opposed war, but she also opposed the violence that the poor experience day in and day out in their everyday lives. Yes, in every age there are prophetic witnesses, conscientious objectors, and a faithful remnant who maintain that the teachings of Jesus Christ and violence are incompatible. When the United States bishops issued a pastoral letter called The Challenge of Peace in 1983, it was highly controversial, did not go over well in many parts of the church. It was hotly debated, even though it treaded very lightly on the question of the morality of the possession of nuclear weapons. In the midst of the Cold War, St. John Paul II weighed in on the bishop's document to make sure that it did not take away the potential deterrent to a Soviet threat of attack by criticizing the stockpiling of nuclear weapons. In recent decades, despite consistent papal diplomacy and lots of time, energy, and resources spent on avoiding war or bringing wars to a conclusion, the United States bishops have been much slower to speak and much milder in their pleas for peace, especially when there's conflict where the U.S. is involved. Now, 2 weeks from tonight, we will observe the 10th anniversary of the election of Pope Francis. And over the next month or so, we will be treated to a lot of analysis of this papacy as this milestone is observed. I will offer my reflections tonight about the role of this first Jesuit pope, who is a promoter of peace in the tradition of his recent predecessors, but who has gone to great lengths to make peace building central to his exercise of the Petrine ministry. There has been nothing timid or mild about Pope Francis' continuation of the work begun by St. John the 23rd, whose encyclical Pacem in Terris reinitiated the work of Catholic peace building some 60 years ago. Likewise, he has restarted the work of St. Paul VI, who famously cried, "No more war, war never again," in his first ever papal visit to the United Nations. Pope Francis now has raised the question about whether the possibility of just war even exists in the present age. He has spoken about the importance of conversion to nonviolence as an important component of the Christian faith. His annual message for the World Day of Prayer for Peace, observed each year on New Year's Day, focused on the theme of nonviolence in 2017. Many individuals and organizations, including Pax Christi International, are urging the Pope to write an encyclical on the topic of nonviolence. Francis, when questioned about this, believes that he already has. Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti are two encyclicals which both call humanity to living in right relationship with each other and with all of creation. That is the essence of nonviolence, right relationships. Both encyclicals describe the horrors of war, and they describe the destruction to human life and to the planet that is the inevitable consequence of war. And Pope Francis describes how war contributes to the crisis of refugees and migration around the globe. Rejecting violence on every scale, global, national, in our streets, institutions, and even in our homes, the Pope calls for individual conversions of heart as well as the institutional changes in politics to make it possible around the globe. His 2017 message said, "If violence has its source in the human heart, then it is fundamental that nonviolence be practiced before all else in families. The family is the indispensable crucible in which spouses, parents, and children, brothers and sisters learn to communicate and to show generous concern for one another, and in which frictions and even conflicts have to be resolved, not by force, but by dialogue, respect, concern for the good of the other, mercy, and forgiveness. From within families, the joy of love spills out into the world and radiates to the whole of society. An ethics of fraternity and peaceful coexistence between individuals and among peoples cannot be based on the logic of fear, violence, and closed-mindedness, but on responsibility, respect, and sincere dialogue. Hence, the Holy Father says, I plead for disarmament and for the prohibition and abolition of nuclear weapons. Nuclear deterrence and the threat of mutual assured destruction are incapable of grounding such an ethics. I plead with equal urgency for an end to domestic violence and to the abuse of women and children. For 10 years now, we have seen how well Pope Francis understands the power of images and gestures, which are more lasting and more meaningful than well-crafted messages and beautiful encyclicals that only a few will read. Pope Francis frequently uses the Italian word vicinanza, nearness or closeness, to describe his ministry to the suffering, to the victims of war and violence, and to all the forgotten of the world. It is a deliberate vicinanza, a deliberate nearness, imitating Jesus, the incarnate Son of God, who draws close enough to us to share in the whole of our human condition. Just at the beginning of this month, we have seen our 86-year-old wheelchair-bound Pope fly into some of the most war-torn sections of the African continent to continue his mission of pleading for peace with the leaders and drawing close to those who suffer the consequences of war with a message of consolation and hope. In Kinshasa, Pope Francis spoke to victims of violence from the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo who were brought to see him. They shared their stories with the Pope, who listened intently and personally demonstrated the meaning of compassion, that is, to experience and suffer with. He spoke to those victims in ways that are heartfelt and fatherly. I am close to you, he said. Your tears are my tears. Your pain is my pain. To every family that grieves or is displaced by the burning of villages and other war crimes, to the survivors of sexual violence, and to every injured child and adult, I say, I am with you. I want to bring you God's caress. God gazes upon you with tenderness and compassion. While the violent treat you as pawns, our Heavenly Father sees your dignity. And to each of you he says, you are precious in my sight and honored, and I love you. Brothers and sisters, the church is and will always be on your side. God loves you. He has not forgotten you, but men and women should remember you too. In the midst of that painful gathering, the Pope found reason for rejoicing and for giving thanks, even as he felt the pain of the victims who spoke of an unimaginable cruelty. A 16-year-old boy got up and spoke about how he witnessed his father being hacked into pieces before his very eyes. And that boy said he forgives the killers. A little girl who was raped 19 times and gave birth to twins. Others who got up and shared their pain also spoke about forgiveness, or at least an openness to the possibility of reconciliation. The Pope knows and has stated on multiple occasions that there can be no just peace without acknowledging and seeking to repair the injustices and harms that have been committed in war. They cannot be forgotten or overlooked. But he also states that real peace begins when forgiveness is offered. As a spiritual leader and a representative of God, the Pope must reveal God's presence, his nearness, and his love in the midst of even the worst atrocities. As a brother and fellow human being, he must notice and feel the suffering of his brothers and sisters and not turn away, avoid, dismiss, or minimize what they have experienced. As the universal shepherd, he amplifies the voice of those who truly embody the Christian message of loving one's enemies. In them, he sees hope for humanity and for the church. The Pope's African journey continued into South Sudan, the world's youngest sovereign nation. And there he was joined by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, together to plead once again with the leaders of warring factions in that new democracy to lay down their arms and work for reconciliation. Those same leaders from South Sudan had already been called to the Vatican at the Pope's invitation to make a retreat. They are Christians of different denominations, and during that visit, the then 85-year-old Pope got down and kissed the feet of those leaders as he begged them to stop the destruction of lives and of the environment that war always occasions. This Pope uses more than words and doctrines. Following the example of Jesus, he draws near to people, and he uses impactful gestures. And even as he was making this pilgrimage of peace in Africa, he never stopped thinking or talking about the war in Ukraine. Now, 3 days ago marked the first anniversary of the unprovoked Russian attacks against Ukraine. And although sometimes Pope Francis's words and gestures have been misunderstood, like when he invited both Russians and Ukrainians to walk the way of the cross on Good Friday last year in the Colosseum, Francis continues to recognize the humanity on both sides of every conflict, the human dignity on both sides of every conflict, to look for goodness, because as we know so well, our leaders don't always represent our way of thinking or being. Although his gestures have sometimes been misunderstood, Francis has called for and worked for a cessation to this war for the entire year, beginning with going personally to the Russian embassy, something unheard of for popes who always go through diplomatic channels at the time of the outbreak of the war. In his Sunday Angelus addresses, he nearly always mentions violence, and he recounts human tragedies occurring around the globe as he presents to those who are gathered in St. Peter's Square an awareness of the suffering of their brothers and sisters in the human family, and he offers an invitation for them to pray with him. The emotion in his voice is often as evident as he describes the pain that affects the body of Christ. And those who are present are aware that Pope Francis feels that pain as well. On the Feast of the Immaculate Conception this past December, as Francis was offering the traditional prayer to Mary in the Piazza di Spagna for the first time since the pandemic, where firefighters go up a ladder and place a wreath around the outstretched arm of Mary situated high above the square, Pope Francis read a prayer composed for the occasion, and he broke down as he prayed. He prayed the words, "I was hoping to come today with prayers of thanksgiving for the end of the war in Ukraine, but instead I have to keep praying." Not only has Pope Francis prayed incessantly for peace and called for peace throughout the war in Ukraine and brought warring factions from South Sudan into the Apostolic Palace and kissed their feet, he has tried again to initiate peace talks between Palestine and Israel, and he has not been afraid to be present in places of conflict around the world as a promoter of peace. His visit to Iraq and to many places destroyed by war, especially places that are sacred to Christians, was also a highly emotional event where Francis realized that the eyes of the world were upon him, and he used the occasion to call out the nonsense of war, the insensibility of war. He has not been afraid to be in places of conflict around the world as a promoter of peace. The Pope has used the personal relations that he has cultivated with Muslim leaders to invite them to join in condemning religious violence and to highlight the peace which God desires for all his people. Since the earliest days of his papacy, we have been warned about what he calls the globalization of indifference. Globalization of indifference, a phrase that the Pope first used as he lamented the world's lack of interest in boatloads of human beings from Africa drowning in the Mediterranean, while the press paid more attention to falling points on the global market. On multiple occasions, he has stated that we are in the midst of a third world war being fought in pieces. We can ever more painfully see this happening before our eyes around the globe, from Ukraine to Uvalde, Texas, and so many other places where racism and easy access to guns have brought the weapons and fruits of war into our cities and even our schoolhouses. Add Yemen, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and places where so many other conflicts are taking place, and it appears that the Pope's description of this third world war is not hyperbole. On the vigil of the Feast of St. Francis in 2021, Pope Francis signed his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, meaning brothers and sisters all, at the tomb of the famous peacemaker whose writings gave rise to the name of the document. Together with the 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, also named from a phrase in St. Francis's writings, this first Jesuit pope in history has given the global church a healthy dose of Franciscan spirituality, highlighting the interrelationship of all creation and the need to live as brothers and sisters in fraternity with all humanity and indeed all creation. Written in the midst of the global coronavirus pandemic, in Fratelli Tutti, Francis laments how humanity failed to come together to address this common threat to the whole population. And he urges humanity now to build the friendships and relationships that will be necessary to stop resorting to war and violence, and to promote the need to work together to address the climate catastrophe currently accelerating. Not only does he celebrate the interrelationship of all creation and of the whole human family, but as in all of his apostolic exhortations and magisterial teachings, he elaborates on the interrelationship of all the issues that threaten human existence, They're all connected, he tells us again and again. Everything that threatens human dignity and human life today. Climate change disproportionately affects the poorer countries of the world who consume far less of the fossil fuels that cause the warming. The loss of islands, the destruction of land and biodiversity, the unusual and brutal weather patterns which lead to greater migration, while the wealthier nations too often close the door to suffering migrants trying to preserve their lives. All of this is a form of violence. Now, among those who read the papacy and study church history, it's commonly affected among insiders that Pope Francis was elected by the cardinals primarily to reform the Roman Curia. We have recently seen, after nearly a decade of his pontificate, the structure that is setting the form for that renewal. A curia that is centered on evangelization, as its name, Preach the Gospel, makes clear, and an administration that gives high importance to integral human development. But really, from the very evening he stepped forth on the balcony of St. Peter's in Rome and was introduced with the name Francis, my heart leaped like those of so many Franciscan sisters and brothers who heard an echo of the Lord's words to Francis of Assisi, "Rebuild my church." This Francis was concerned with far more than reforming an organization or its bureaucracy. He wants to reform the church by using its foundational document, the gospel, the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ. Given the joyful encounter with Christ, which Francis radiates everywhere he goes, along with his attention to human dignity and his insistence that Christ is to be encountered first on the peripheries, on the margins, with the people considered disposable, it is altogether consistent that this pope would declare the death penalty to be inadmissible in today's world, and that this pope has reopened the question of any war can be just in today's circumstances. This pope has initiated a global dialogue within the church and has been a constant advocate for dialogue beyond the church. He doesn't see the church as an end in itself, but in the spirit of Vatican II, the church is a servant to the world who must bring the good news of Jesus to the world. Francis finds the importance of this reaching out in the witness of Jesus, who ate and drank with sinners, prostitutes, and tax collectors, and who revealed his Father's love, which, like the sun and the rain, falls in the good and the bad alike. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis insists on the difference between forgiving and forgetting, calling the former always possible, even if exceedingly difficult, as he witnessed later in Congo, and the latter, forgetting, inadvisable, because we must always learn from our history. No lasting peace can be fashioned without reconciliation, and reconciliation is a process, a painstaking process that will inevitably have setbacks, but it is vitally important to restoring the peace that God desires. A process that begins with restoration and a sincere acknowledgement of harm so that healing might begin. Something that the U.S. has yet to learn with its history, especially regarding the ongoing consequences of slavery and our treatment of Native Americans. Pope Francis has called for a missionary conversion in the church, prioritizing mission over maintenance and not permitting the status quo in our parishes, dioceses, and institutions when the need for spreading the gospel and the peace that is promised in the gospel is pressing, and the need for humanity to come together as one is urgent. In the farewell discourse of Jesus found in John's gospel, he promises a peace that the world cannot give, a peace for which we pray in every Eucharistic celebration before we physically express our desire to be at peace with all. The Holy Father is teaching us that the peace which the world cannot give will not be produced by technology or science, not even by the best diplomacy, but by recognizing the dignity of the human person and the global fraternity that we are all called to live. It is when we become neighbor to the other who is different than ourselves, as the Good Samaritan did, that we foster the peace that the world cannot give. To speak of a just peace means, in the first place, that we're not really or merely speaking of the absence of war. In the fuller Hebrew sense of the word shalom, we mean the web of right relationships that allows people to flourish and live together in community and interdependence. Today, we're expanding our understanding of that interdependence to include all of creation. The opposite of peace, which is often expressed in violence and war, is to live the falsity of self-sufficiency and to live without regard for the well-being of the other. It's not enough to work to prevent war, which we too often fail to accomplish anyway. We must actively engage in peace building, which means creating and fortifying the life-giving relationships which allow us to see that violence against another is actually harming myself. For many, this sounds too utopian, impossible to realize, outside of real human experience. For Pope Francis, not only is it possible, but our human existence and survival depends on it. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church says that the promotion of peace is integral to the mission of the Church in the world. It is part of continuing the salvific mission of Christ. It even says that the Church is to be a sacrament of peace in the world, the visible sign of the peace that Christ has already established in his death and resurrection. But the Church fails in this mission or radically falls short of its fulfillment when the Church is not a force for unity in the world or does not experience unity within itself. Because of the reality of sin and selfishness, peace will only be possible through forgiveness and reconciliation. Mercy is God's nature, Pope Francis frequently reminds us, and we are called to reflect God's forgiveness and mercy. But the reflection of forgiveness and mercy does not eliminate the need for justice and truth. These are actually essential to the process of forgiveness. But faithfulness to a merciful God must always reject the path of vengeance. Even when such vengeance might philosophically be justified, it will always contribute to the expansion of the cycle of violence, which inevitably harms not just the perpetrators, but all. Again, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Pope Francis said, "It is in God's name that together with all the victims and all those who work for peace, justice, and fraternity, I condemned the armed violence, the massacres, the rapes, the destruction and occupation of villages, and the looting of fields and cattle that continue to be perpetrated in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as the murderous, illegal exploitation of the wealth of this country and the attempts to fragment the country in order to control it. It causes indignation to know that the insecurity, violence, and war that tragically affect so many people are disgracefully fueled not only by outside forces, but also from within, for the sake of pursuing private interests and advantage. I turn to our Father in heaven, who wants us all to be brothers and sisters on this earth. I humbly bow my head, and with pain in my heart, ask him to forgive the violence of man against man. Trying to create peace in the midst of war is the greatest test of peace building. Peacebuilding should be emphasized as the way to prevent the occurrence of war. And that kind of peacebuilding will require the clear denunciation of injustice that the Pope exemplified. In Scripture and tradition, we have the concepts of peace as the sign of God's kingdom. It's part of our eschatology, what we look forward to, our hope for the world to come. The prophecies we hear in Advent of swords beaten into plowshares and spears turned into pruning hooks and of lions lying down with lambs. The prayer that Jesus taught us invites God's kingdom to begin in the here and now by putting his teaching into practice. We also have a spiritual notion of peace as the internal state of a person in right relationship with God. The moral theologian Kenneth Himes points out that in the teachings of the popes, there is also a need for political peace, that is, the right ordering of society for the common good. Pope Francis speaks of this extensively in Fratelli Tutti. He talks of political friendship and even political love. While political peace may be fragile and must constantly be protected, it should be more than the partial peace that is the mere absence of war, sanctions, deterrence through weaponry, etc., which maintains order and can keep violence on hold, but is always threatened by the lack of trust, the imbalance of power, and the imminence of the possibility of mutual destruction in war. St. Paul VI popularized the slogan, "If you want peace, work for justice." And in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, there was great emphasis on promoting integral development in the materially poor parts of the world. From those experiences, even with their achievements and successes acknowledged, there was often a failure to foster relationships of mutuality. And so instead they created cycles of dependency and an ever-increasing imbalance of power. St. John Paul II, again building on the work of his predecessors, spoke of the importance of solidarity and relationships of interdependence, with a greater emphasis on participation in social life and in the drive for the development of a just society. The Church teaches that participation in society is a human right. And Pope Francis has gone so far as to say that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," should be amended today to "Thou shalt not exclude," because exclusion amounts to death. Since at least the time of St. Augustine, the Church founded by Christ, the peacemaker, has wrestled with the reality of sin, concupiscence, and the resultant violence that can escalate to war. A theory of just war builds on the right to self-defense and appropriately includes the duty to protect the innocent. A complex theory that contained both justifiable reasons for going to war, always as a last resort, and criteria for just activity within war, the protection of civilians, proportionality, etc. However, our recent popes have questioned whether in a nuclear age, with multiple nations having the capacity to destroy all of humanity, there can be any war considered just. The very issue of the possession of nuclear weapons has been declared sinful by Pope Francis. Limited possession of nuclear weapons had been legitimized as a deterrent until now, especially during the Cold War era. But Francis notes that there's too much instability among leaders in the world to be able to guarantee that these weapons would only be used as a last resort. The cost of maintaining these weapons, in terms of money, in terms of the materials needed and used, adds to global poverty and hunger and threatens the natural environment. In 2022, Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe, where nuclear weapons were first developed and continue to be developed, issued a pastoral letter calling for nuclear disarmament as the responsible Christian stance in the world today. The Church needs more bishops, pastors, and lay faithful to join their voices to this call. It cannot just be a peripheral concern of the Church, when the so-called doomsday clock, demonstrating how close the world is to nuclear destruction, has been reset once again on January 24th of this year. It's now set at 90 seconds to midnight. Maybe that realization could influence our Lenten practices this year. Can I inform myself about situations of injustice and spread what I learn to others? Can I look internally and pray to root out tendencies toward violence in my own heart and mind when I'm impatient, when I refuse to understand the perspective of another, or even imagine the worst motives in every person with whom I disagree? The antidote to that globalization of indifference, according to Pope Francis, is the revolution of tenderness. Where do we need to practice such tenderness, such vicinanza, such nearness? St. Francis of Assisi lived in a spirit of fraternal love, simplicity, and joy. And while he never set out to form an order, he drew thousands by the authenticity of his witness. By acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we too can share that joy, that simplicity, and contribute to the rebirth of a global aspiration to fraternity, because the world depends on it. Thank you. I think Father Michael now is going to facilitate any questions or comments coming from those of you gathered here, and even those of you online have a way of submitting those.
There's no way to submit them online, but we have people here.
Sorry.
Maybe somebody online can text somebody that's here if they want. That was riveting, Bishop John. Thank you so much. And in our parish, for Lent, our focus is on forgiveness. And that logic of saying peace is not possible without healing, and healing is not possible without forgiveness. And Jesus is, God is mercy and forgiveness. Thank you so much for that.
Thank
and
Pope
also your
Francis.
thoughts about politics and political peace and political friendship and love.
It was a startling term when I first read it.
Yeah.
And I realized it wasn't, Francis wasn't the first to say it. But when we understand that politics isn't meant to be a dirty word, partisan politics can very well be ugly and dirty, but politics is the way we resolve issues in a democratic society, right? And if we
Are
don't
there any
resolve,
questions, comments? There are refreshments in the back, but maybe some discussion about what we have just heard. Yes, Anne.
The concept of just war seemed to be receding until Ukraine. How has that changed?
yeah, the major issue that has to be addressed is how do you protect the innocent, right? And so there are those of us who think we have to be more creative, we have to work to different ways to prevent Russia from being able to attack Ukraine. But in the meantime, how many lives are going to be lost while we're continuing to defend? So there is not a perfect solution yet. We're still looking for that. That's why we have to really put the emphasis on how do we prevent war, and then how do we keep this one from escalating into a nuclear war.
We need the microphone for the people online.
Isn't one of the central issue is what do you do with a thoroughly aggressive opponent, such as Nazi Germany during these, which led to the Second World War? Platitudes and talking just doesn't do any good. What do you do with a situation like that?
Yeah, so the question is how do you cut off the authority and the power, the ability of these people to carry out evil and we haven't found the peaceful way to do that. But as a society, and especially as a church, we have to continuously work to discover that and work for ways to contain evil rather than trying to annihilate it once it's started and once it's gotten out. But we find ourselves in difficulty, especially now, to protect the innocent.
Thank you so much. One of the things I was wondering about in listening to your wonderful, wonderful kind of reflections and insights is just if you were delivering this among your fellow U.S. Catholic bishops, what would be the degree of receptivity difference that you might experience even in that group, and how do you sort of attempt to sort of address that? Because, in terms of looking at your very first point, it goes back to, at least 2 decades ago when we used to talk about Catholic social teaching as our best kept secret, and it's still pretty much under wraps, and you've talked about it not necessarily being something as a subsidiary, but something fundamental, and, sort of how that is, the spirit of that is, how much of that is taking place among, your fellow bishops.
It's an excellent question, and I never thought that, to be a member of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, one would have to fight to defend the Pope. But the truth is, the United States bishops, in large numbers, are not on the same page as Pope Francis. So they're coming at things from a very, very different perspective. They fail to understand him, and I think he brings the whole experience of the Latin American church to the center of the papacy. When he was stepping out on that balcony of St. Peter's 10 years ago, and he said the cardinals went to the ends of the earth to find a bishop of Rome, he meant it geographically, but also he means it to the periphery. And now somebody from the periphery, from the part of the world that we didn't take all that seriously in the so-called more developed countries, now we have that at the center of the church, and it's very hard for the powerful nations to understand. And what Pope Francis continues to demonstrate is that nearness to the people whose islands are going to be disappeared because of global warming, and those who have suffered the results of war and are refugees and migrants because of war. What the U.S. bishops need is to become more familiar, to get closer to that kind of reality. And I think unless they do that, I'm not sure they'll understand why this is so important. And if we really use the influence, now of course with the sexual abuse and everything else, we've really lost so much of our authority and our ability to speak convincingly that is taking a toll on the credibility of the church. But it seems to me the way to build it back is by humbly engaging in the various struggles of the people who need salvation most, that need to be rescued the most. And I don't think that we're well equipped to do it. So in the role of the superpower, the United States bishops in 1983 couldn't be as bold as they wanted to. The current group of bishops doesn't want to be that bold. I'm all the more grateful for people like Archbishop Wester, who says, let's take a look at what's at stake here and really hear what Pope Francis is saying about if we can't come together to resolve a virus that brought the whole world to a halt, what are we going to do about climate change? What are we going to do about the unleashing of nuclear warfare? So I wish I had a better answer to your question, but I know I'm going to keep bringing it up and striving to make that central. And I'm grateful for those who do. But I also think that's why many people walk away, our young people in particular, that do not hear the church speaking about the issues that are life and death in their minds.
Well, thank you, Bishop, for a very inspiring and enlightening talking about what Pope Francis is doing. And I'd like to, as an LGBT Catholic parishioner here, I'd just like to go off topic for 1 second and say thank you for being one of the very few bishops in the country that's spoken out on behalf of LGBT Catholics and the community. My question is, when we hear what Pope Francis is doing on a global level, you mentioned at the end a little bit about what we can do as individuals, and I'd like you maybe to expand or repeat a little bit of that. What can we do to contribute in a small way to the bigger movement of
Great.
peacemaking?
Yeah,
Thanks.
you know, I think for Americans, and those of us in the United States, the first thing we have to do is be aware of what's going on in the rest of the world. We can be so isolated and so unaware. So we fight over whether there is climate change or not, where other parts of the world, they don't have that luxury, right? And many parts of the world know that they can never live by the standard that we live in the United States, and they're paying the cost of our consumption. So to become aware of that, and that's the part of the conversion that has to take place. So any one of us can feel pretty helpless or incapable of doing something on that global level. And I think that's where the example of somebody like Teresa of Calcutta comes in and knows that I can help this one person and bring this one person to live in dignity or to die in dignity. I think we have to do what we can in the places that we can, and it really starts with awareness about what the world is going through. And then we start to question, how can I simplify my life? How can I make sure that I'm not contributing to a situation that forces people to migrate, that forces people into refugee situations? How do I not contribute to war and building up for war?
Bishop, thank you for a beautiful talk. I would like to ask you a practical question. I'm in Pax Christi, Metro New York, and one of the members is troubled by the fact that does not belong to this parish, but rather a parish in Brooklyn, and rarely hears any mention of peace from the pulpit. Rarely hears anything about peace building just in relationships within our own groups or families, which is really where the peace building starts, if you ask me. Any suggestions?
Yeah, well, again, I think what Pope Francis says is so beautiful here, when he connects the violence that he's witnessing in Congo to domestic violence at home and the attitudes in our hearts that can be so violent in how we react to other people. So much of Fratelli Tutti is about how we've done politics, right? Instead of give and take so that we can find the solution that works for everybody, it's winner takes all, and everybody else is annihilated. We don't have opponents, we have enemies, and all of that works so much against the basic concept of Christianity. Now, we ought to hear more about that in church. We ought to hear about it, in yesterday's gospel about the temptation. What are our temptations in the world today? Has Jesus experienced temptation to be part of the dominant thing, bow down to Satan and let him take it all? What do we bow down to? We bow down to guns. We bow down to violent resorts to so many of our problems. How do we make it happen? I think we need to let our priests and deacons and preachers hear that we need to hear more about violence and the lack of, we need to hear more about violence and the virtue of nonviolence as part of the Christian message. It's very central to the gospel. Wasn't it Gandhi who said the only people who don't see Christians or don't see Jesus as nonviolent are Christians? We miss that very central part of the gospel.
One over here. There you go.
Bishop, thank you for the insight and the reflections. I want to ask you, could you expound a little bit more on the concept of self-defense, defense of others? I'm thinking of, right, somebody comes to attack my wife or my daughter. If I walk into a building and a woman is being raped, or if I'm at Uvalde or Parkland or wherever, and there's a chance that using violence could stop this person from killing more people. Can you expound on
Well,
the
our
concept of-
tradition has always justified that, and those remain the unanswered questions about how do we go to a complete pacifism. That's probably why we've never embraced an entire pacifism as a church, because we haven't been able to account for how do you defend the innocent And how do you respond to aggressive evil? Those are real questions that we don't have simple answers to. You know, the ideal would be, how do we disarm somebody without causing harm to them themselves? But in the spur of the moment, do you have time to think all of that? There are some wonderful examples for people that have been trained in nonviolence that have found ways to disarm the other person just by causing them to think or see something different. But it's really heroic. It's so much the exception to the norm. We still have to account for evil in the world. That's the reality with which we live. But how do we not contribute to that evil as we resist the evil? I wish I could write the answer to that and sell 1 million books.
Shall we? Okay, one more.
Hello. Did you ever meet Bishop Dave O'Connell from Los Angeles, and can you tell us, say a few words about him? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up his memory. Yeah, not only did I meet him, he was the most recent chair of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which is a great work of the U.S. bishops. So we take up a collection every year in November that supports projects to lift people out of poverty where they themselves are working on the solution and creating jobs. He was the most recent chair of that committee, and I got to work very closely with him, especially about exposing more of our seminarians to those opportunities to work with that group of people. But Bishop Dave O'Connell came from Cork in Ireland and spent all of his priesthood in the inner city of Los Angeles. Even at the time of the Rodney King police violence, he negotiated a peaceful response to that and calmed the communities down as they worked for more justice. Really a man of God who dies a victim of violence. We're still in pain over that and wondering, you know, what was the cause, what led to that. We're still not sure about so many pieces, but he left a wonderful testimony. There are people gathering outside of his home still daily in prayer, and his funeral services will happen later this week on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of March. But a major loss to the church in the United States, and a true peacemaker called home to the Lord. Thank you for bringing up his memory.
If there are no more questions, then perhaps we'll close with this, that when the question came, what can we do individually? And I thought of today's gospel, Matthew 25. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty. You gave me to drink. I was naked. You clothed me. They're all within our reach. Small things. We are insignificant, but to listen to a friend who's in distress, to calm down the waitress or the nurse who's overworked, to give her a little peace. I think to recognize the homeless person on the street. These are all little gestures of bringing peace. Bishop John, you've brought us great peace. You're a great witness to your Franciscan heritage and also to your Ignatian training. And thank you for these insights into peace. We will bring them with us all through Lent and beyond. God bless you. And I think you'd like to meet. Okay.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Please hang around for a bit, and I'm sure people would like to say hello.
Gladly.
Thank you, and good night to all of you in live stream.